Hello everyone, welcome to History Forge. My name is Taylor Hamlin, and I'm going to be going over a primary source analysis today. I'm going to be working on corroboration. So I will show you what skill we're looking at right here. As you can see, we're on primary source corroboration, and you can kind of see a little bit of what we did last time. Corroboration is when you compare and contrast two things, basically, or two or more things. And there are several skills that go along with it, the simplest being just listing similarities and differences between the two sources. So, as you can see here, I have listed similarities and differences of the two or more sources. And I have similarities and differences right here as well. So this is what the box we're going to use. And if I go over here, you'll see the source. It's called the First Great Awakening. Now, we are right now working with religion in class. And so we want to make sure that we are looking at religious sources, looking at things, how colonists were religious, so on and so forth. So if I scroll down, you'll see the First Great Awakening. I'm going to pass that and look at this very first paragraph. I forgot to activate my pen too, so I can write notes. Here we go. All right, so should see everything here. Looks like, yep, looks like my other screen is good. So I'm going to go ahead and read the source, and then I'm going to read some primary sources. And again, the idea is to corroborate. We're going to compare and contrast. We're going to write similarities and differences between two sources. So, looks like my other computer is good to go, so we're going to begin. Religion was an important factor in the American colonies from the very beginning. But in the 1740s, the colonies were swept by a religious movement called the First Great Awakening. The most popular preacher of the period, George Whitefield, traveled across the country holding revival meetings attended by thousands. Nathan Cole's account below shows how intense the movement was. Nathaniel Hinchman's letter to Whitefield shows that some traditional ministers did not welcome the revival. So as we can see here, we have these two different men who are a part of the very large religious revival in the colonies. The colonies were predominantly Christian, although they did have some Jews and Muslim groups that did live there because of people that were either forced to come to the colonies or people who traveled themselves. When it comes to this, though, even though the colonies were religious, it went through stages where some people cared less for it, and then all of a sudden we called it a revival. Like all of a sudden, like Christianity was much more important, and you start seeing these things. That's why we call it the Great Awakening. People like woke up. They were woke, as they say. So, my bad joke aside, we're going to look at these primary sources. First, we're going to look at letter to George Whitefield, Nathaniel Hinchman. And I'm going to read the source information. Remember, always read the source information when you're doing these things. And remember, if you're using this for an essay, or you're using this for a project, or you're just here to listen to something about religion, always be very vigilant of the primary source. Be listening for key words. Be listening for a lot of words that have the same theme. For example, are there any religious themes in this? And there's probably going to be quite a few religious themes. That was my very bad spelling of religious. All right, so the source. Nathaniel Hinchman was a minister in Lynn, Massachusetts. He blamed Whitefield for breaking up all of New England's churches. This document is a letter to the newspaper in which he addressed Whitefield. So right here we say a letter to the newspaper. So we know that he wrote this letter to somebody else, but he put it in a newspaper, which means everyone could see it. We call it an open letter. So everyone who read that newspaper could see this, and this is probably why we actually still have this document, because there would have been thousands of newspapers. We would have been able to save at least one of them, or somebody did, and that was eventually put into a museum or copied. So let's read this source real fast, and then again, keeping in mind, we have to compare it and contrast it to another source. So, Boston, Evening Post, 15th of July, 1745, to George Whitefield. It is beyond dispute that you have sown the pernicious seeds of separation, contention, and disorder among us, and by cherishing the separatists, key word there, and your injurious insinuations respecting ministers and unacquainted with Christ, talking about the Lord, you have greatly impeded the success of the gospel and struck boldly not only at the peace and good order, but the very being of these churches. Viewing you in this light and faithfulness of Christ and the souls of my flock, I desire you not to preach in this parish, but rather to hasten your own charge, if any you have. I have little expectations that you will pay any regard to what I have wrote, but leaving the event, I choose thus to declare against your services with us, as a dangerous man and greatly injurious, underlining dangerous, to the interest of the undefiled religion of Jesus Christ. And then he signs it, Nathaniel Hinchman, pastor of the First Church in Lynn, so that we know who he is because he signed it. So, a lot of information I underlined. I underlined words that I thought were religious, and so George Whitefield is a very religious man. He thinks that this person, Nathaniel Hinchman wrote it. He thinks George Whitefield is not doing the right things. This guy, Nathaniel Hinchman, thinks that the old traditional ways of following Jesus in the church should be more honored. And so, as you can see, he's very passionate, he's very angry, and there's a lot of things we can use here. So let's scroll down real fast. We're going to pass the questions. We're going to go to the testimony of Nathan Cole, and we're going to, again, have similarities and differences, okay? So, source for the testimony of Nathaniel Cole. Nathaniel Cole was a farmer from Middletown, Connecticut, who heard George Whitefield preach in 1740. The experience convinced Cole to find salvation and become born again. So, this guy named Nathaniel Cole is one of the people that is a part of the Great Awakening. He was not religious, or he was less religious, and then he wanted to become more religious. So he is a part of this movement. He would have been a person that was following George Whitefield. He would have been inspired by George Whitefield. So let's go ahead and read on. One morning, all of a sudden, about 8 or 9 o'clock, there came a messenger and said, Mr. Whitefield preached at Hartford and Wethersfield yesterday and is to preach at Middletown this morning. So I'm going to underline Mr. Whitefield at Hartford. He lists a lot of other places that we could maybe use. If you're using this for a project, these are all useful information. You can use dates, places, because you could Google those or try to search them. I was in my field at work. I dropped my tool that I had in my hand and ran home and run through my house and bade my wife get ready to go and hear Mr. Whitefield preach at church. I'm going to highlight this area just to remind myself to talk about it. Okay. I should be too late to hear him. I brought my horse home and soon mounted and took my wife up and went forward as fast as I thought the horse could bear. So he's very excited. So right here, I'm going to write an E to be excited, just to remind myself. And this one, I'm going to put a G for grammar. As I came near the road to Middletown, I heard a noise, something like a low rumbling thunder, and presently found it was the noise of horses' feet coming down the road, and this cloud was a cloud of dust made by the horse feet. As I drew near, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, scarcely a horse more than his length behind another, all of them lathered and foamed with sweat, their breath rolling out of their nostrils in the cloud of dust of every jump. So basically this entire thing is saying that people are so excited to see George Whitefield that they race their horses to go see him. That's how excited people are. It's like it's like racing your car down the highway and there's thousands of cars to go see somebody that's speaking. Every horse seemed to go with all his might to carry his rider to hear news from heaven, from saving of souls. So he's talking about religion. It made me tremble to see the sight, how the world was in a struggle. So he thinks the world is not in a good place right now. When we got to the old meeting house, there was a great multitude. It was said to be 3,000 or 4,000 of people assembled together. We got off from our horses and shook off the dust, and the ministers were then coming to the meeting house. I turned and looked towards the great river and saw the ferry boats running swift forward and forwarded, bringing over loads of people. The oars rowed nimble and quick. Everything, men, horses, and boats seemed to be struggling for life. I want to keep skipping it because he's basically talking about how a lot of people are there. So again, he's just talking about I'm going to put a lot, just because that's what he's talking about. Great multitudes of people. When I saw Mr. Whitefield come up the scaffold, he looked almost angelical, a young, slim, slender youth before some thousands of people with a bold, undaunted countenance. And my hearing how God was with him everywhere as he came along, it solemnized my mind and put me into a trembling fear before he began to preach. For he looked as if he was clothed with authority from the great God, and a sweet solemn solemnity sat upon his brow. And my hearing him preach gave me a heart wound. My God's blessing, my old foundation was broken up, and I saw that my righteousness would not save me. So, wow, he wrote a lot. And I'm trying to remember, what did he write this in? Did it say? So it doesn't say what he wrote this in. It almost looks like a journal or a diary to me. And so we'll talk about that in a second, but he wrote a lot more, and he wrote in a very much different way. So let's focus on similarities. There's a lot more differences. So again, we're going to go back up here to Nathan Hinchman. Look at time. We're at 10 minutes. See if we can wrap this up in 5 or 6. So we got this guy named Nathaniel Hinchman, who is writing to George Whitefield. We'll say something very similar. So let's say similarities are, similarities. Oops. Both men are talking about, what's his face? To George Whitefield. Okay, that's one similarity. Let's find another. Let's see. Both men are very moved by Christ and religion. I think that's a fair assessment, especially seeing how much they wrote about it. Let's scroll down to see if we can think of anything for him. Let's see, similarities. What else did I say? Both men think that their way of following their religion is the correct way, and they believe the opposite manner is incorrect. I got that because I think that George Whitefield, or the guy who wrote about George Whitefield, he wants to be a traditionalist. He kind of judges George Whitefield, but this guy says that, no, the traditional way is wrong. He even says right down here, by God's blessing, my old foundation was broken up, and I saw that my righteousness was not to save me. He's basically saying the old traditional way is not going to work, like this new way is going to. So those are some differences. I'm sure there's a lot more. I'm going to keep the video short. And remember, whenever you're doing these sources, you're going to find things that I don't find. And so it's really important that you use your head, use your critical thinking. I could spend an hour probably going through these sources. So I'm only going to spend a little time looking for similarities and differences. And I'm going to go ahead and look for for differences now, because there's going to be plenty. First one I noticed was grammar. The first letter and the second written document have different grammars. So, for example, the second one has worse grammar. You can kind of tell by right here. It says, I dropped my tool that I had in my hand and ran home and run through my house. It sounds very, rural or country. It sounds like a person who's less educated. This person seems more educated. And it makes sense, as Nathaniel Hinchman's a pastor, so he would have been brought up with reading and writing, so he's more educated, whereas this person's probably less educated. So, I don't know, I noticed the grammar, so it could be useful for you, because you might be able to argue, well, people who were from a working class or people who worked were more likely to go to the new minister, whereas people who were educated and knew how to write and were familiar with the old style of religion wanted to stay traditional. That's something you could have said, or could say. What else? Oh yeah, the second letter spends a lot of time describing how popular George Whitefield was. Whereas the first one is condemning George Whitefield for not teaching Christ, or teaching, we'll say, Christianity well enough. And again, I'm getting that answer because if you look at the very first one, he basically just ripping into the guy. He's basically saying, like, yeah, you're not great, you're not doing the right things, you are striking boldly at Christ. Like, he's making it sound like this guy's, like, not a Christian. Whereas this guy is saying, oh my gosh, I was so moved by him. I saw him and he looked like an angel. Like, he actually said something like that. Right down here, when I saw Mr. Whitefield come up the scaffold, he looked almost angelic, a young, slim, slender youth. So he's like, oh my God, he looks like an angel. He's moved by him. So we can even say that too. The second letter, or the second written document, the author is spiritually moved by him. Whereas in the first letter, the author is judgmental. And by him, I mean Mr. Whitefield, or Whitefield, so I'm going to say that. And here's the deal, you know, we're at 15 minutes, and so I don't want to take too much more time. All I really want to show you now is you need to use the race strategy. And if you don't know what the race strategy is, or you're unfamiliar with it, it basically means you need to tell me in an answer, like what I've just done, you need to say something like this. So both men are talking about George Whitefield. That would be your first part of the race strategy, right? So I'll highlight that. Didn't work. Okay. Maybe this. Nope. Okay, so I'm turning everything Halloween color now. Here we go. Okay, so that's your first part, right? You need evidence now. And so you get rid of that. You need evidence. And evidence could be, you know, any of these lines. Like the fact that they're both talking about Mr. Whitefield. Like both people have quotes about Whitefield. So you need to write a quote from both people. So again, you write a quote like this. You write quote from both men who are writing about Whitefield, and you would want to show both quotes, okay? You'd want to show both quotes and introduce them. And then that would be your second part. That is the second part of the race strategy. So I'll just go ahead and bold that out that. And then the last part, which I'll italicize, is you explaining the quote. You could say something like, here, I'll just use one of them as an example. I'll use Nathan Cole. Nathan Cole, let me see. So we'll say something like, according to Nathan Cole's quote, he saw Mr. Whitefield. We can even put a date in there, because I think he even had a date. Yeah, October 23rd, 1740. On October 23rd, 1740. And was so moved by him that he wrote about the event in some kind of written document. Possibly a journal or diary. There, done. That's the three parts. And in this part here, we call that the explanation, right? So again, if you're my students, you've been hearing about this for a long time. And we're going to keep on hammering at it. But I'm not going to go through every single one, but every single one, you need to have the exact same thing. Every similarity, every difference. You need to have proof and evidence. And if you're writing essays, this is going to be massively important, okay? So write this stuff down, use it for yourself. If you're writing this on a paper, do so. But I'm going to go ahead and log off here. So for everybody else, if email. All right. You have any questions for me, let me know. My name is Taylor Hamlin. I got a lot of social media out there too. You can find that on the description below. Feel free to follow along. If you have suggestions on how to make these videos better, please let me know. If you're a teacher and want to help me make some of these videos, I know I had a couple teachers offer the other day, so that's awesome. The idea is to build these things more up. So if you have any questions, please let me know. But otherwise, have a great day, have a great week, and enjoy yourselves. Take care. Bye.